Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our very first One City, One Story 2022 program in honor of Susan Straits in the company of women, in the country of women. And you can see the wonderful cover on our brochure. And I hope you've all had an opportunity to go to one of our branches, pick up a brochure, or look at it online for all of our programs. And I hope also you had the opportunity to tune in on Thursday and see Susan Straits' presentation. If you weren't able to do so, you can go to YouTube Pasadena Library and see her presentation from Thursday, March the 10th. All of our programs for One City, One Story are being recorded as well, and you can share them with your friends. So in order to make the enjoyment wonderful for everyone, would you please mute yourself? Thank you very much. Dr. Cathy Gudis will be starting the program shortly, and we want to thank her very much for presenting today. We will have chat questions at the end of the program, and if you could please write them in chat, I will ask them for you. There's live transcript for today's program, and you need to enable that on your own program on your own computer for the program as well. So we have lots and lots of programs today to start One City, One Story, and special program today is A People's History of the Inland Empire, from citrus to logistics. This program will focus on race and the power of place, as seen through the transformations of the cultural landscape of inland Southern California and the people who have helped shape it. From the era when citrus was king to today's inland empire of warehouses and logistics. Today's program is presented by Dr. Cathy Gudis. She is an associate professor of history, director of public history program, Pollitt Endowed Term Chair for Interdisciplinary Research and Learning in the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of California, Riverside. And we are delighted to welcome her as our first program to augment One City, One Story 2022. So welcome, Cathy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Make sure I have. I was really delighted to be able to participate in this series, particularly because I am a long admirer of the work of Susan Straight. I have been a colleague with Susan's at University of California, Riverside. And when I arrived, I looked and realized how wonderful our creative writing department was. And I immediately said, well, I'm going to start reading all of the work of the people in this really fine department. And I quickly realized that that would be a real lifetime endeavor. However, as you might detect from the title of my talk, I'm really interested in the ways in which we can understand place through story. And so I have a deep admiration for the ways in which Susan has been able to create such robust elements of the history of the region through both her fiction, her memoir writing, and also her nonfiction. And in many ways, they, for me, really collide. Though I have been trained as a historian, I really value the ways in which story helps us use or center human beings on the landscape, both of a physical landscape and a cultural landscape, and that which sort of occupies us in our very bodies and memories in terms of engaging with place. So I think by humanizing the ways we understand history, Susan does just a remarkable job in bringing us across time and into a variety of places. And in doing so, she really tells some very personal stories, but then, zooms out again to let us know about the particularities of the people who have been involved in the stories that she shares of her own extended family. So I'm going to share a few places that are related to what Susan had been talking about, and that really bring us across a fairly broad swath of history. And that history is one that is related to a period of time that really goes back to the earliest white settlement all the way to the present day. And so I'm going to share my screen momentarily so that I can sort of give you a visual tour through some of the places that surround the stories that Susan shared last week and that are part of her book that's being honored in this series, as well as the new book, which is coming out today. So I'll be a little bit of a mouthpiece for the opening of her own new project, or its launch at least. Okay, so hold on one second and I will open up my screen here, which is always that moment of awkwardness. So hold on one second. Okay. Okay, here we go. I had a little bit of a problem with my slide deck, so I'm trying to make sure that I don't sort of freeze up because it's a huge file. Okay, here we go. Bear with me. I know this is always the most grueling part of, and of course my screen is having a little bit of a tizzy fit. So hold on one second. We have just finished at UCR in our quarter. So I've been lucky enough to teach students in the inland region at UCR almost the exact same sorts of issues, and in fact share quite a bit from Susan's work through a course that I teach called LAIE, Race, Place, and Story. So let me open with what perhaps, for those of you who may not be familiar with the region today, is potentially a slightly different perspective. Welcome to the Inland Empire. Once considered the Citrus Empire, where oranges were the new gold. Today, the Inland Empire is carpeted, it's blanketed in almost 1 billion square feet, 1 billion acres of warehouses and logistics centers, that which is a far cry from what we might think of as the longer histories of the region rooted in citrus. On the upper left, you can see the train coming through the groves with the bucolic images of the trees around it. Today, we see warehouses on our aerial views as far as the eye can see. And I have to say, in the course of this history, there are not surprisingly a few labor and land issues that are core along the way. These were built at a moment when land was declared cheaper than dirt. And again, it's another contrast to what we know of this region when in 1895, the Orange Empire was dubbed, and when Riverside had the status of being the wealthiest city in the nation per capita. Today, there's an amazing excess of over 40% of all goods coming into our country that go through the ports of LA and Long Beach, that go along the 8 interlocking highways that are close by, bringing you from the ports up through Southeast LA, along what has been dubbed today a diesel death zone. stuffed with glorious containers of all of the things that we like to have delivered by the very next day at our doorstep. Before it gets there, it has to go along a variety of trade routes, that global supply chain, which lands our goods in Southern California along places like this, what I call the hidden infrastructures. They're so big that we hardly notice them. They're ever present, they're huge. This is the Alameda Corridor. It's the subterranean train tracks where the trains can move unimpeded through South LA before they head, and there you see the underground rails, before they go through these intermodal rail yards. This is the biggest one at BNSF, Hobart Intermodal by Commerce. Up to the Inland Empire. Here you're looking at left at yet another BNSF intermodal train yard. Immediately next to where we've got this wonderful Nunez Park adjacent. I don't have to tell you all that much probably about the problems with having that park next to the train yard, as well as the fact that as people go to work at Amazon Fulfillment from those same neighborhoods, where now the land has been taken over by companies like Amazon. Amazon is the largest employer. 1 out of 8 people work at Amazon, and it's in many ways been what some people, like today's San Bernardino Councilman Ben Reynoso, calls a pipeline to poverty. So what do we do with this story, and how can we understand the people connected to the places and the ways in which the global supply chain and the Inland Empire, oftentimes being seen as a hinterland to the coastal cities, has been developed over the long history and historical periods that we can cover by tracing this trajectory from citrus to logistics, as I call it. Not surprisingly, as the images of the diesel death zone might tell you, the Inland Empire counties of San Bernardino and Riverside are among the most polluted places. For a while there, they were among the most polluted places on the planet. Today, they're actually along the same lines of LA, but where LA can oftentimes see clear skies, we find that once those areas from Pasadena all the way out to Redlands and beyond, that during the summer, we hardly can see the mountains at all. A surprise to people who move to the area in the winter, and then come summer, realize that there is a toxic sludge in their air that's formed from diesel particulate matter. So how do we address this? Well, many of us have been talking about the ways in which we might think of logistics as an empire in itself, an empire of logistics. And how do we actually reconcile ourselves with these far more popularized images of here, the citrus belt, all the way from Pasadena through the inland region. Here you see on the right that of course romanticized postcard view sent by visitors to the area to their friends back in the Midwest, along with photos they'd pose for with signs set up right here. I'll eat oranges for you, you throw snowballs for me. And so this citrus belt stretched from Pasadena west to Redlands in the east, paralleling, of course, the foothills, as you know. The citrus empire, the orange empire, was actually dubbed that for a variety of reasons. One is because of a trolley line that brought people from Los Angeles and Pasadena out to the area that was called the Empire Line. And another reason was because the way that citrus actually developed in the area was through the cultivation of a crop that had been sent to a woman named Eliza Tibbets. And of course, I'm also adding her and a few other women to this for Women's History Month and in the company of women and in the country of women. And so Eliza Tibbets has dominated much of the citrus heritage memory of the region, positing a very grassroots enterprise where a woman who in fact has her own crazy history and past, she was an abolitionist who came with her husband to the area, was continued those ideas about abolition, but she was also a spiritualist, and she was known for holding seances in which people would come together to sort of lift the table with her. So she was an odd figure who also displayed herself by modeling herself after Queen Victoria. So I have these two images left and right. But that connection and that Anglophilia, which has also characterized the region out in the Inland Empire, we continue to have a Dickens festival, for instance, is not only because of her or because the way that promotional images of the area use the phrase Orange Empire, but also because it in fact was a bit of an empire. When there are challenges in being able to create the canals to funnel the water, there were investments made by a syndicate of British investors who actually helped the industry take off. And when they did so, it was in part to be able to serve agriculturally these incredible fields that were being cultivated by a sweet derivation of citrus. It was the navel orange that Eliza Tibbets had gotten from someone from the USDA. And I know you have a speaker later on who's our beloved curator of the citrus collection at UC Riverside, who'll be talking about this genesis. But I like to point to this as a way to understand that the romanticized imagery that we have of citrus that was popularized through postcards that rarely showed the labor or the laboring classes. And I dare say that when in 1895, Riverside was dubbed the highest per capita income, that not a lot was done to try to also record the annual income of those migrant workers who had come from different parts of the world to help us be able to be an empire of citrus. So on the right-hand image, you see one of many of the postcard images of Riverside that are showing the train car coming through. The woman is wearing this lovely duster, which sort of implies that she had been in her, late 1910s or early 1920s automobile to make her visits. And it also suggests that the way that everyone lived was with this Spanish colonial styled mansion that would have been set among the agricultural fields. Yet what we also know is that that style of the Spanish colonial revival architecture was as much of a mythologized past as was the image that lacked citrus laborers. In fact, those laborers, and this is a much later image, were more likely to either be encamped in the fields themselves or in bunkhouses that had been constructed for people. That British syndicate, in fact, had even constructed amidst the groves here some different housing, and it was segregated housing, which would be able to house both the Italian laborers who had come in to be able to lend some of their agricultural expertise before they sort of split off into doing some of the work in grape agricultural labor, and then by the 1910s, 20s, and early 30s into vineyards, right? So the area was also covered on the flatlands with lots of grape cultivation that Italians kept going, which reached its peak in the 1950s. But the laborers for these enterprises were typically those people who would eke out an existence by being encamped and who later were able to really build up entire towns that were adjacent to the train tracks and close to the packing stations. So in fact, in Riverside, it was Chinese laborers who enabled the industry to take off. Many people had come from the Midwest imagining that this was the labor of gentlemen farmers, but in fact, that wasn't the case. Indeed, Native Americans had been pressed into service. Another good way to understand this long history of the land and landscape by bringing Native Americans into this idea of empire as well. Native Americans had actually been utilizing the same own properties alongside the Santa Ana River because, of course, one needed that water in order to sustain oneself. And then oftentimes during the summer, people would move up into the hills. So Cahuilla encampments after white settlement taking over the land for agriculture were oftentimes forced back into the hillside, but would also come down at times of drought in order to gain the kinds of income that they needed now that they were displaced from their lands through the wage labor of citrus. So they were alongside Chinese laborers and some of the freed Black people who had come with a Mormon settlement in the 19th century. And all were put to labor to clear the land in order to cultivate agriculture and to be able to build the canals and tend the canals so that they could irrigate the crops. Chinese who migrated to the area came from regions that were well known for their own citrus cultivation. So when we think about the ways in which Riverside cultivated this particular cash crop of the navel orange, which was known to be especially sweet, we have to remember that in fact, it was Chinese laborers who lent know-how to enable that citrus to be packed with care, yet in a way that it wouldn't rot by the time it was taken to its next stop. So here you see a few images, first of a Native American encampment under the trees. And then we also know that there were Chinese and then also Korean as well as African Americans who tended the crops. In fact, African Americans took the opportunity after being freed to be able to work both in cultivating this landscape, but then to also own their own small groves. Israel Beale is an example in the San Bernardino County area and in Redlands, where he was able to marry another California native African American, Martha Embers, who had come and was a descendant of those folks who accompanied the famous Biddy Mason, who they had come with the Mormon settlement as enslaved people and then fought for their freedom. Some indeed stayed and became the pioneers of the region. They were able ultimately to purchase land and to build a home and to realize that they could have autonomy. And so from church pulpits, we understand that African Americans were advised to purchase land to be able to have a real sense of Black nationalism and freedom through economic independence. And so Israel Beale was among those people. Today, he's commemorated by being named after a park being named after him in the Redlands area. So in fact, I named this presentation A People's History of the IE to be able to document and to share with people through a variety of methods, these kinds of stories of people whose records aren't always within our traditional libraries and archives, but oftentimes are with the families of those who have cherished the stories and continued to tell them. Susan Straight is, of course, one of those storytellers who's listened in the driveways of many families, including some of the other families who can share their stories of both the 19th and 20th centuries, when in fact, tourists as well as African American settlers were told through flyers in the South, or for Midwesterners who were white, through flyers and newspaper articles in the Midwest and further east, that they should come to this land of sunshine. For African Americans, it was seen as a promised land. Of course, once they got here, they didn't always experience it that way. And the imagery of this then goes across different racial lines, is what I'm trying to convey. So this is an image that actually was also promoting the opening of the Union Pacific Rail Station. And it was a way to also invite people by staging these kind of very celebratory festivals. So when the train would come in, they might be greeted by some locals dressed in Spanish garb, because of course the architecture they were being met with, the Union Pacific Station, for instance, was Spanish colonial revival, which of course is very strange because that's at the same moment as America in the 1920s is extremely xenophobic. In Southern California, those who had been here, the prior waves of immigrant groups and white settlers, were not so keen on all of those migrants and immigrants from Mexico. And so they began to sell the region as particularly Spanish, meaning a way of connecting with a European past rather than that of all of those new settlers, those Mexican settlements who weren't seen in the same light, right? They were being depicted and being put into a position of a proletariat or a working class or an underclass. So the Spanish colonial past is quite a surprising thing, but also one that's laced with elements of white supremacy, where we're positing a very particular past for the region throughout Southern California, and certainly tied up with the citrus industry. A wonderful scholar who teaches in the Chicano Studies Department at UCLA, Genevieve Carpio, has written a wonderful book on this that's called Collisions at the Crossroads, in which she talks about the inland region, Riverside and others, and talks about this as an Anglo fantasy past. And we kind of see this in play here with the women dressed up meeting the train that then would take people, and they were sponsored by, oftentimes, the famous Frank Miller, whose own Mission Inn still stands as an emblem of that romanticized past, promoting the idea that there was a mission that had originally been in Riverside, which of course is not true at all. He had fabricated that past and sort of had a phantasmagoria that mixed up all the styles of all of these other missions. And he used these bells all over the Mission Inn, which of course today are also the branding for Riverside itself. And so people would get off the train planning to go to the Mission Inn, where Frank Miller and a women's association were upholding that Spanish colonial past by leading people down a street that was also laced with these arbors that would give shade so people could walk from the train station down the street. And here's Frank Miller on the left, dressed up as Junipero Serra, to help push forward this idea that our citrus colony was in fact descended from the Franciscan friars themselves. Of course, those early citrus groves were planted for the Franciscans by Native Americans at the missions, at San Gabriel, et cetera. And in fact, they were pressed into service to build them here. And Frank Miller liked to promote this image for himself and the region, as well as his hotel. So he'd often go around dressed up like the friar. Here he is at Mount Rubidoux, where there is a cross at the top that's called the Serra Cross. And so we can see the ways that this is baked into the region itself. And then when you got off that train bound for Frank Miller's place, you might stop at the Sutherland Packing House, the fruit company where you could go into the top floor and you could look over and into people, all women, who were packing the fruit below. And then you could yourself purchase a carefully wrapped box to be able to ship back home, wherever home was. And look at this, is the Wells Fargo Company Express that's going to take it back to the railroad station where it would be shipped again. And so this became part of a touristic enterprise. And then after you went here, again, I was trying to trim my slides because I have way too much for the time available. But after you went here, you might get on a trolley car that was sponsored by Henry Huntington himself, along with Frank Miller, that would take you to another place that was set up like a campus, because it was the Sherman Indian Institute, also bedecked in Spanish colonial style, where those self-same tourists would be able to take the trolley. that Frank Miller promoted to a site that Frank Miller had also promoted, which was where Native American youth were brought for an off-reservation boarding school where they were to learn and to assimilate into the civilized ways of the white settlers in the region. Oftentimes this meant forcing them to cut their hair. They oftentimes would dress in military garb so they could be trained and disciplined, and would parade around the Spanish colonial grounds where visitors could see them. So we can sort of see again the multiple meanings of empire. The ways in which labor was promoted was also in terms of the way it was spectacularized by also promoting the women workers. By the late 1800s, women were the primary packing house workers, while men were the pickers, and they oftentimes were brought to the festivals that were the citrus festivals, where their work was promoted as glamorous and where they themselves would kind of pose for cheesecake shots, if you will, sort of part of this same kind of, promotion of the region. And I kind of love these images, so I'm sorry I have a whole bunch of them. These are from the National Orange Show in San Bernardino in 1935. And I love that image of the women rolling the citrus in competition down the streets to promote the industry. And you see people dressed in the background and they're wearing coats, right? So these poor women on display in their bathing suits. But these are really these sort of festive, again, phantasms that kind of suggest the ease of the industry. And in fact, women would often write to the chambers of commerce looking for employment in the early 1900s. This is for an exhibition that my wonderful graduate student, who's now Dr. Audrey Meyer, put on. We've worked together on collecting stories, both oral histories and other narratives and archival materials that are becoming part of a digital archive called A People's History of the IE. And she found these letters from women in the Midwest looking for work, respectable work, right, in a place where they could afford to live. And so this was an important way that women's work became packing house work pitched as respectable labor. Like this letter from the men at the Chamber of Commerce wrote back to them, said, "The work is light and pleasant, requiring only a clear head and nimble hand. Some of our best lady packers make from $2.50 a day to as high as $3.50 a day." Well, needless to say, when we do the math later, we find out that in a way, you'd have to be superhuman to gain those riches, and that they earned about 2.5 cents for each box that they packed. So here are some images of those citrus packing houses. By the 1920s, and certainly by the late 1930s, mostly Latinas would populate the packing houses. This is a great postcard that's in a collection at Claremont schools, and I'm going to stop very shortly. That is from 1939, a woman writing home to her mom in Spanish to say, here's a picture of the packing house where we work. Now, up in the upper left is an image of another woman who's the fastest packer at the Corona College Heights packing house. This photo was taken in 2018 by Tom McGovern as another project that I worked on with Audrey and with him and with Juan Delgado to take these pictures of packing women and men who also pick, who are also largely Latinos, and to be able to populate the region with their images and with poetry that kind of tells some of their stories. And we've placed them at the California Citrus Historic Park, which is in Riverside as well. And so these are a couple of examples of the ways in which these are stories of the roots of the region, where entire towns and neighborhoods were developed next to the packing houses and along the train tracks. This is the area of East Side that Susan Straight writes about in many of her books, and that's part of her memoir and the stories she shared last week. This is an image of the colored mercantile hall, which dates to about 19 1913. It also had on the second floor a social hall, which was utilized not only from African Americans who were prohibited from using social spaces elsewhere in the city, but were allowed in this East Side neighborhood, which was multiracial, and where we also know that other ethnic minorities also had social gatherings. Here it is today, where it still stands, the building still stands as an African American and Latino gathering space as a Masonic lodge. And so all of this ought to tell you something about the multiracial neighborhood that was east of the train tracks, where we also can understand larger stories about Japanese Americans and also Korean Americans who had their first settlements in this same neighborhood of East Side. The most famous story is that of the Harada family, who tested exclusionary laws that prohibited people who were considered ineligible for citizenship from owning land. It was passed in 1913, and it was called the California Land Act. And the Harada family had begun to settle in the area early on, following some other Japanese who had moved to the region and ran restaurants and boarding homes. They followed suit, and they opened the Washington restaurant, and they had 3 locations, and they had boarding rooms associated. When one of their children died from tuberculosis, they worried about the health of their family, and they decided they wanted to move. So they moved to a neighborhood that was on the west side of the train tracks, which was a white neighborhood on Lemon Street. This is their house. It still stands today. Their neighbors decided they did not want a Japanese family in their neighborhood. And so they filed a lawsuit against them that ultimately went to the California Supreme Court that tested the 1913 Land Act, but did not find it unconstitutional. What it did find was that the Haradas had a right to purchase that house because it was in the names of their American-born children, and that those children who were American citizens ought not have their property rights removed from them. So the Haradas were allowed to retain their home and to continue to live there, and this is their family who lived there. And they stayed there until the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when first their home was checked out by FBI, who came through to see about the ways in which some leaders in the community could potentially be spies. And then different members, all the members of the family, were instructed that they needed to be removed forcibly from their homes. They sold all of the items in their home and their restaurant, but they were able to put the house in the hands of a friend named Jess Stebler. Sumi Harada, after the war, came back. Her parents had passed away. She came back and opened this house to boarders who had no place else to live when they returned from the camps. She stayed there. She was a bit of a pack rat. All the contents of her house she held on to. Ultimately, upon her passing, her family very generously donated the house and its contents to the Riverside Museum, now called the Museum of Riverside, who continues to steward it and the collections. Now, members of the Harada family had originally owned another house on the east side of the train tracks, that multiracial community, and no one bothered to pay any attention to that fact. No one slapped them with a lawsuit. And that was because that neighborhood, as I mentioned, was multiracial. It was where people who weren't able to purchase homes elsewhere by the 1910s and 20s, especially, settled. And of course, they couldn't settle elsewhere because racial covenants were being used to exclude them from those other neighborhoods. But in fact, in the East Side neighborhood, we see many African-American youth and families, as well as Korean families. In fact, it is the first established Korean-American settlement in the United States, outside of Hawaii, that had a church, it had families. And here we see an image of the school where Mary Pack Lee, who in her memoir tells us about her family arriving in Riverside by train, and then moving into a house in Eastside, which was across the street from a Japanese settlement, in a little pocket of homes that had a dirt floor. They had been used by Chinese workers who had built the railroads and then left, moved on to other places. And so Korean families had moved in. They had fidelity with that earlier wave of Chinese laborers. And so they began to compete with the Japanese laborers who had sort of taken over the citrus labor work crews. And Koreans were able to gain some financing, both through collaboration with other more established Chinese residents, and also with Cornelius Rumsey, who was a white settler who had citrus groves and hired them. So we start to see a really nuanced portrait of a lot of different races coming together. And also, ultimately, by the 1950s, their neighborhood being subjected to gerrymandering, so that the schools were almost entirely that of Black and other people of color. Japanese Americans, of course, were forced out during World War II, and not as many returned to this neighborhood. However, it's also the neighborhood where the first desegregations of the schools took place voluntarily when families from different racial backgrounds, particularly African American and Latino, came together to contest segregation of schools. So how does that get us here to where we are today? Well, from this area of a multiracial community built on citrus, we begin to see by the 1950s and 60s continued disinvestment, and the area becomes poorer, the jobs more scarce, because what begins to replace the citrus groves is in part what we see in some of these images, like right here, which are warehouses that were originally built in the 1940s as part of the defense industry to help manage the supply chain. Those were built in order to move goods to Manzanar, in order to build the camps as an instant city for those who were removed from LA and other coastal areas along the West Coast. So the US Army built the supply quartermaster station right here in Riverside's Miraloma area. And you can see here, they continued there after supplying Manzanar, after supplying the troops that were training out in the desert in the 1940s and during the 1950s Korean War. In fact, it was those supply warehouses brought so many jobs that developers came in and began to build tract homes in the 1950s. This also displaced the vineyards and the citrus groves. With its own lacings of problems. Here, sorry, my slides are a bit messy. This is just some images of where the goods were trucked and taken by the same trains that were the infrastructure for citrus. Of course, military establishment helped offer some employment for people who no longer could work the agricultural jobs that were being developed. So around these Air Force and Army bases, we start to see more industry. We also know that Kaiser Steel Mill was another 1940s, and I added this because Susan talked about it last week, another place where people, particularly of color, could find jobs and advancement. But it was a military establishment. It continued actively until it was shut down in the 80s, at the same time as the citrus industry was just about kaput, and at the same time as we also started to see the lands that were used for military begin to be closed and repurposed because of the efforts of military base realignments to close and to remove the jobs from the area. Tens of thousands of jobs were lost, and the lands began to be sold off to the highest bidders, which were these warehouses, which have come to take over this broad swath of land, such that the remnants of that citrus heritage that we see in places like Redlands are the fragments of groves and these palm trees, which mark the path, the roads today that are being retained as part of that heritage conservation of the region, to remind us of a past of citrus that had once been part, and this is from a few years ago. These are all covered in warehouses. There's a little snippet of this citrus here, but almost all of these are gone now. And instead, these are all warehouses. This image was produced to show that, look, you could use solar on the top, and look, we still have our heritage because we've got these palm trees which marked the roads. So if you were in the midst of all of these citrus groves and you needed to find your way out, you could aim for those taller palm trees to find your way. So today, instead, we see this, this takeover of the area, and we see community members who themselves are the descendants of the citrus pickers and packers, who now work in Amazon as pickers and packers, and who are trying to push back against the impacts of logistics on their air quality and quality of lives today. So I'll end with this because I've run out of time, and because I want to be able to take some questions, and to also tell you that part of this entire story I'm narrating is really the result of doing oral histories and archiving them as part of what come June will be a digital archive that you will be able to visit. We have some of it archived already through the California State Library, and other elements of it that are being housed through a mapping project that's at the University of Redlands that's focused on African American Latinx histories, as well as other groups in the inland region to constitute a people's history. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry I've taken so much time. Too enthusiastic.
Well, what a fabulously interesting program, Dr. Gudis. Thank you so much. And I can see you did the same thing that I did. When you think of Susan Straight's book, and she tells so many stories, you think of In the Company of Women, as well as the actual title of the book is In the Country of Women. And you spoke about the women that worked in Riverside, that worked in the orange grove planting factories, packed the oranges, made minimum wage. So, and then all the other wonderful stories that you told along the way. So it was a fascinating program. Thank you very much. Dr. Gudis is delighted to answer anyone's question. So if you want to put your questions in chat, I will be glad to ask them. So tell us more about your digitizing. How can we go if we want to see more photos? Do we go to University of California, Riverside, or?
Well, you know, it is not a live. I wish that I was sharing this in 6 months. It's currently a project that students have been really doing a lot of the drudgery, something that the librarians who are here will understand. We're essentially building a community archive that's comprised of collections of cassette recorded oral histories related to the citrus industry, as well as other videos of communities who had lived along the 10 freeway that were organized by Inland Mexican Heritage, a wonderful person and historian who's been documenting these histories. So we're helping to support that by digitizing, and slowly we'll be making them available. In the meantime, however, I will tell you about some of the recent collections of African American histories that with the University of Redlands and the California State University at San Bernardino, we've also been doing. And this is part of a project that fits in with a people's history. It's one component of it called the Bridges That Carried Us Over project. And I'll put the links in the chat, and I hope that you'll go and visit them, visit some of these videos that are here and the oral histories that we've all been working to transcribe and to continue to collect. And I definitely would love to tell you a little bit about the Citrus State Historic Park in Riverside. That in fact is what led me to work with my colleagues on the Bridges That Carried Us Over project. Because with some colleagues, we were interested in learning more about African-American history in the region. And several of my students and I have been working with the California State Historic Park in Riverside on a project called the Relevancy in History project, where we really couldn't understand what the role of African Americans was, given the longstanding Black community in the area, especially in San Bernardino. And what we found was that, in fact, several members of a man who was named John Adams, who his extended family and later generations shared through oral histories with us, that they had been passed down stories about their great-grandfather, who had actually been the one who budded the citrus, who budded those plants for Eliza Tibbets, and who worked with the Citrus Experiment Station, was the early roots of the University of California at Riverside. And so at the California State Historic Park, we began to share those stories and met with different community groups who said they wanted to see themselves represented there. And so we did some more oral histories and were able to create an exhibition at the park, which is about 35 acres of different citrus that you can learn about, that you can walk through the groves to be able to experience. Some of the groves are commercially farmed so that you can go down the hill and purchase some of that fruit. We actually, the photo you saw of Elizabeth Carranza, the contemporary packing house woman, is actually a woman who packs the fruit from the acreage at the state park, because we were tracing the fruit as it went through the different stages. And so if you go to the park today, I hope you'll look for the exhibition, Finding Ourselves in the Groves, Stories and Storytellers of Citrus. It's the only state park to document, preserve, and represent the histories of California's really rich citrus heritage. And we've been trying, as part of our partnership with California State Parks, to be able to create a much more, a diversity of stories that connect with students and that reflect the demographics and the settlement patterns of the state at large. So I really urge you all to go and visit. It's a really interesting place, because you could see some of the elements of this very development that I talk about, and you'll see some images that are located there that are what I shared as well, because this project has been kind of close to my heart over the last 5 years in trying to collect more resources. And then we ultimately, in pairing with other universities, said, we got to find a way to share this beyond exhibits. And so that's the genesis of this community archive.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everyone will look forward to going. Is it open every day, or
on the weekends, on Thursday through Sunday, you can take tours. And then, of course, right now the citrus is in bloom. As those of you who have trees in your backyards know, you've been getting those really wonderful fragrances for a few months, probably off and on, depending on what you have. So it's a good time to go, and they have scheduled tastings. So just go to the California State Park website, and you'll be able to schedule a tasting and a tour. And also, if you go on the weekends, you can visit the visitor center to be able to learn more about the history of citrus in the region, and to also, hopefully share some of your comments. There are a couple of places where you can share some of your comments. And I'm actually going to put my my email address in the chat, so that you can write to me if you have any stories of citrus, if you have recollections you want to share, photographs that you would want to share and have digitized, not that we would take the photos themselves, because this is an ongoing project. And it's wonderful because we weave it into our classes at 3 different universities. So it's trying to inspire a younger generation, as Susan was also talking about, to really learn the stories that often remain untold because they are so personal to families, and yet they do localize these larger narratives that are so significant to not just our families, but much more broadly. They enable people like me to teach my classes, to be able to represent the nuances of the past to my students. So I'd urge you to reach out if you have any questions or want to share any stories or know people who might want to be interviewed.
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of people that have family stories. And interestingly enough, my husband's family is from this Fillmore, Santa Paula area, and his grandfather and great grandfather owned orange groves out in Riverside. And all the young men in the family had to ride a train down to Union Station in LA and then go out by the red car. And during the summertime, they all had a watering schedule. And each young man would then water and then ride back. And then the next one would go down and oversee whatever needed to be done. And it was just kind of when you got to a certain age, this was what you were expected to do for the family. And it was all of the family and the cousins and everyone. So we're really not sure when it all stopped and they all ended up selling the orange groves that then became all of these logistics and warehouses out in Riverside. So I'm sure there's lots of other families in different areas that have the same kind of story.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting being able to look at the aerial views, because my presumption had been that in the 1950s, like in Orange County, it was all paved over. But in fact, it takes a long time for that to happen. And Tracy Kahn will talk to you all about what happened, because it does have to do with the different ways in which disease and a couple of freezes and things like that affected the crops. And one of them was a disease that you had to literally plow under the groves themselves, because the ways in which the disease would spread. And so many people found that it was just not economically sound for them to be able to do it. And so in the 60s, we start to see the pressures for housing tracts, and we see the city itself and the region really questioning its own what it's about, its own history. But by that point, there's more work in industry and military. And so people are selling their lands, and they're moving to the Central and Imperial Valleys. And they're doing so in part because the scale of farming, of course, begins to increase. And so by really by the 70s and 80s, there are far more families that have retained their groves, partly out of sentiment, and partly because they're still eking out an existence. They're not going that big route, or they found ways to ship the crops, and this is into today, to Asia, where there's been a demand. So there's a lot of nuance in the stories, but it's a big story because it's a big story about infrastructure, and it's a big story about logistics, about how you move your goods, how do you get your citrus to markets far flung. And I have to say it's contemporary, because when we think about the Ukrainian-Russian war right now, part of the issue has to do with logistics. How are the Russians getting their supplies? And the US forces, even in World War II, had logistics down pat. We had been figuring this out on a massive scale, and we can kind of narrate little teeny pieces of that logistics story, from this localized picture of the region, from in the inland region in particular.
Well, your program was absolutely wonderful. Everybody is saying thank you so much. This presentation has been so enlightening and extremely informative. Thank you so much. You spoke about another program that's going to be presented by Dr. Tracy Kahn, and that program is the Riverside Citrus Story, and that will be presented on Wednesday, March the 30th at 5 o'clock. On Zoom. So I encourage you all to attend to that one. If you want to know more about the history of the Mission Inn, please attend Steve Locke's program on Wednesday, March the 23rd at 5 o'clock. And then you showed us the Queen Victoria citrus label. And we know that Queen Victoria, or I'm pretty sure she never visited Riverside, but she would have liked, maybe there was a citrus in Italy that was sent to England at that time. And so she might have, or she might have been able to get something from Riverside that was sent to her. So there's a pictorial presentation of California citrus crate labels. And the Pomona Public Library has an amazing collection of the citrus crate labels. And that program's on Tuesday, March the 29th. So out at University of California, Riverside, are you collecting citrus crate labels?
Oh, the library has a huge collection, as does the Huntington. The Huntington and UCR's labels are all digitized. So if anyone is looking for that as source material, it's there. It's great. Look for the ways it's romanticizing and the ways in which sometimes it's downright racist. And remember, these long histories that are part and parcel of the ways that promotional literature work.
Right. So it's just a fascinating story, and you can go to so many different tangents from the citrus program. So thank you so much for sharing today with us a people's history of the Inland Empire from citrus to logistics. And we appreciate you all attending today and look forward to welcoming you at other programs. And thank you so much, Dr. Cathy Gudis, for all your time today.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.